Ladies and gentlemen, some weeks ago I received a phone call from Dr. Elmer McKay of Green River, Wyoming, formerly of E Company, 119th Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. He told me of a reunion to be held by his company in New York State and invited me to attend. When I told him I couldn't fit it into my plans, he asked if I would make a tape to be played at this reunion. And I couldn't think of a good reason not to, so this is the result. I put together, with no small help from Dr. McKay, some 3x5 cards with some notes of battles, a little humor, and other reminiscences of World War II, and specifically the 119th Infantry Regiment. Here's the results. Let's go back 43 years to 13 June, D+6. Our division was a floating reserve, and we landed on 13 June, 6 days after the initial landing in the Omaha beachhead. Our regiment moved into an area just above Isigny, the large town in the Omaha Beach area. Not very large, but larger than the other very small hamlets. We dug foxholes, and I can remember vividly that I was scared. As a matter of fact, 99% of the people of our regiment was scared. Sounds of war was around. Medium artillery was landing, not a giant distance from our regiment, and I recall those foxholes got deeper and deeper. I can also recall Gabriel Smither, the adjutant of the regiment, came around to my slit trench with a bottle of brown-looking liquid that he said was Calvados. In our country, we call it Applejack. It was so strong that it made my hair stand up on end, it felt like. But you know, it made me feel a lot better. In a few days, we moved into the line. The regimental headquarters was in the edge of Isigny, this little town that I mentioned. I can recall driving through the town, seeing a latrine built into the side of a dirt cliff, open on both sides. The French were very non-shy in going to the bathroom, we learned very quickly. Later, I was driving through Isigny, and I felt the need of nature, and I tried to find that latrine again. It wasn't a large town. I knew which side of the road it was on. I couldn't find it. There were a few civilians around, and I stopped and asked a man where his latrine was. In my best French, I said, "Où est votre latrine?" And this little Frenchman thrust out his chest with pride and said, "Monsieur, the whole of France is before you." And I thought that was real kind of him. Starting at that point, the regiment learned how to fight. We'd had good training. We were in tip-top physical condition, but until you get in battle, people don't know how to fight. We were in an extremely good place for the Germans to defend. We were in the hedgerow country. We called it bocage. Hedgerows was a fairly high earthen dike built as a fence around an agricultural field. And on top of that hedgerow were planted bushes and trees. So each time we advanced through one of those hedgerows, we were confronted with another one a short distance away. The Germans had a beautiful defensive setup. By the way, the farmers had passed their land down to their sons. Let's say a farmer had 3 sons. He divided his field into thirds. And each built this hedgerow, which made a great defensive position for the German army. It was the toughest fighting of the war for our regiment. Casualties were high, progress was slow, and we learned it the tough way. Operation Cobra was on 25 July and was a major battle by the Allies. All of the troops in the beachhead were involved. It amounted to a breakout from this narrow beachhead and predominantly to break Patton's Third Army loose. Our division had an extremely key role in Cobra. I would say of the frontline divisions, this division and one other on our right were the key role divisions in punching a hole in the German line and allowing the Armored Division to start moving out faster to increase the pace, increase the shock action, increase the momentum of the movement of the Allies. It was a black day for our regiment and several other units in the beachhead. I refer to the short bumming. On the 25th, just before our regimental headquarters started walking forward to move out in the attack, we were about 5 miles behind the exact line at that time. I was called a phone by the assistant G3. Telephone was in a SCR 193 on what we called the Jeep at that time. Actually, later we called it a command car. It wasn't the Jeep as we know it. It was a larger vehicle. After the telephone call, I was walking back and the first squadron of heavy bombers dropped short and landed squarely on our regimental headquarters. For your information, we lost 55 casualties, killed and wounded, in the headquarters of the 119th. We were the heaviest hit unit, one of the heaviest hit units in the entire battle area. I was bounced up and down. I hit the ground fast. I was bounced up and down by the force of these heavy bombs landing. I had 5 NCOs in my S3 section. I was the operations officer of the regiment. I had 1 survivor, 1 tech sergeant, who I promoted up to master sergeant and slowly over the next week filled back my section. My master sergeant was stark raving mad. Wasn't a mark on him, but he was so close to the concussion bombs that his mind snapped. Incidentally, I gave that assistant G3 a box of cigars later on. At the time, I was very irked that he called me back to that phone. I couldn't find the commanding officer, Colonel Sutherland. I don't know how many of you remember him vividly, but he was quite an ugly man. He was almost as ugly as I was. And I looked for him and couldn't find him. I thought of finding Colonel Quinn, who was the exec, turning all the information over to him and telling him he was in command of the regiment. Then finally I saw him. He rushed toward me and I rushed toward him, and we put our arms around each other, and the first and only time I ever hugged him. But I was glad to see him, and I know he was to see me. The final result, though, the regiment did jump off. We did secure our objectives, and the 30th Division accomplished its mission in Operation Cobra. The next major battle, and it was as key, if not more so, than Cobra, was Mortain. We arrived in Mortain on 6 August. Hitler decided to make a major counterattack. He ordered it personally, utilizing all of the reserves on the West Front. 4.5 divisions were to be involved. The 1st SS Panzer, Adolf Hitler, Leibstandarte. The 2nd SS Panzer, Das Reich. The 2nd Panzer, which we had just met around Trosgott, and it was a tough outfit. The 116th Panzer, which we had met in a major counterattack when we were moving south from Messigny. and the 17th Panzer Grenadier, which was not in good shape. It had been heavily used and was down to about 50%. So I say 4.5 pretty darn good units, several of them as good as Germany had, the first three I named. Arrayed against this was the freshly arrived, moving south 30th Division. Later, the 12th Regiment out of the 4th Division was attached, and CCB was later attached from the 3rd Armored Division, General Boudinot's combat command. Plus enormous amounts of artillery, as Patton's army passed through the southern base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Artillery battalions were dropped off as the extent of the German counterattack became known, and we had all the artillery we needed to help smash the Germans. Oh, I forgot one other element. On the German side, they had a battalion of King Tiger tanks, 72-ton tanks, a ferocious animal. Had an 88mm gun. And although they broke down fairly often, when you ran into one in defense, it was quite difficult to dig out. So many of our weapons would not penetrate its frontal plate. This battalion was making the main effort during the German counterattack right down the Bartholomew Ridge. We defenders, the 30th Division and its attachments, went down to roughly 50% strength as a result of the incessant slamming of this massive armor with supporting infantry against the area around Mortain. Hitler wanted to choke off the breakout of Cobra before it could let Patton deploy fully. He wanted to choke off in the area of Avranches, Mortain. Well, he failed. Finally, he saw it was impossible to move, and I think von Kluge was relieved as a result of Mortain, of commanding the West, and Rundstedt was put in. When the Germans withdrew, and the people that do such things counted enemy tanks in the 30th Division area, they came up with a figure of 99, a great many of them Panthers and Tigers, Mark V, Mark VIs. And of these 99, they estimate that 30 was knocked out by tactical air, Pete Quesada's 9th Air Force and elements of the British tactical air, 400-mile-an-hour Typhoons. All I can say is I was terribly tired because I got very little sleep for 3 days and 3 nights when the major portion of the counterattack raged. Incidentally, the headquarters of the 717th Regiment was overrun by enemy armor during this attack. An entire battalion headquarters was captured out of the 120th Regiment. So much for Mortain. We got 2.5-ton trucks, and we started moving faster and faster out into France. We were the first Allied forces into Belgium, and we commanded the first major Belgium town, Tournai. 119th, our regiment, took Tournai. I can vividly recall a wagon loaded with small arms ammunition that was burning just before you entered into the main part of town, and we had to detour on a very poor road to get around this exploding ammunition. Those of you who were with E Company in that period will probably vividly recall that exploding ammunition. It burned for a day or so with rounds going off. The day after we took Tournai, the British 21 Army Group under Field Marshal Montgomery came strolling up the road and entered the town. The papers announced that the British had taken Tournai. They were supposed to take it, but the 119th moved faster. We took the town, but it never came out in the paper. We turned due east and moved straight toward Germany, all the way across Belgium, into Holland, near the town of Heerlen, Maastricht. where all the girls spoke English to our great relief, and nosed into the edge of Germany up against the Siegfried Line. The 30th Division was chosen out of the new 19th Corps. The 9th Army was created at this point, Lieutenant General Simpson commanding, and we were in the 19th Corps commanded by Raymond McLean, a very fine soldier, also Lieutenant General. The 30th Division was chosen to penetrate directly into the Siegfried Line and then turn south and roll up the pillboxes of the line down to Aachen, tying in with the 1st Infantry Division, which had penetrated to the south of Aachen, taken some high ground to the east, and were waiting to somebody to cover their flank, and the 30th Division was chosen. Well, this was tough fighting. Taking pillboxes is always tough if they're strongly defended with good troops. I'm happy to say E Company distinguished itself in this fighting, particularly Sergeant Harold Holycross and PFC Jack Lash, both of whom ultimately made battlefield promotions and ended up first lieutenants. Their predominant area of brilliance on the battlefield was in taking these pillboxes. The 30th Division accomplished its mission. It arrived down on Ravel B and tied in with the 1st Division, securing a complete encirclement of the historic city of Aachen. And for those of you who like such facts, Aachen was the first capital of the Holy Roman Empire. Became so in the year 800, and the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was Charlemagne, a 7-foot giant, and he's buried in a church in Aachen, and it's my understanding from history that he's buried sitting up, holding his sword in his hand. I can recall the towns of Herzogenrath, Kohlscheid, Würselen. Würselen was an extremely difficult area to fight in. Hitler again made a statement that Aachen would not be surrounded. It was very dear and close to the hearts of the Germans. We met the 1st SS again there and the 5th Paratroop, which is an extremely good unit. I took over the 2nd Battalion on 29th November, just about this time. Left my job up at Regiment as Operations Officer. Shortly after taking over, I received a phone call that a 2-star general was rooting around up in the front line. I hopped a Jeep and rushed up there to see what this general wanted, and he'd already gone. I must have received a word real late. He'd been there some time. Turned out he was General Hubner, commanding general of the 1st Division. And he'd come over and gone all along my frontline platoons, thanking the men for getting up there and clearing part of Ravel B and tying in with his unit, because he needed his flank covered, and he was losing troops with an open flank, and he wanted to thank the guys that did the fighting. I appreciated that. And amazingly, 10 years later, almost to the day, I was able to thank him personally. I was in the War College at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and toward the end of the year, each class has a national strategy seminar where there's students are broken out into teams of 16. Each team has a couple of civilians, outstanding civilians, and one of our civilians was a gray-headed man about 65, the director of civil defense of the state of New York. His name was Clarence Hubner, and he was a retired 4-star general, went from PFC to 4 stars, in the Army. I thanked him. I told him I commanded that battalion, and we had quite a bit of reminiscences there. I also told him that I appreciated his division, because every time we were by it a couple more times, they held up their end of the stick, and that wasn't always true when other divisions were by us. Merzenhausen was an area where the 2nd Battalion did a good job, particularly E Company. Sergeant Osterlin distinguished himself in this battle, and he later too was promoted in a battlefield promotion. The Germans struck in the middle of December '44 in the Hürtgen Forest and obtained strategic surprise, tactical surprise. The 30th Division, along with several units of the 9th Army, were loaded in trucks. We moved 100 miles south and were spread across the spearhead of the main effort of the Bulge. As a matter of fact, the 119th hit the 2 main points of the 1st SS, which was to be the 1st unit in Liège and Maastricht, and I presume Antwerp, which was the ultimate decision. Definitely, the commander that captured me was most interested in road conditions around Liège, Maastricht, etc. I'm not going to talk a great deal about my capture. I was captured on the 21st, was held for 90 hours. I am going to tell you that I'm sending a copy of an annex I dictated the moment I got loose, and it was ultimately published as an annex to an intelligence summary by the 18th Airborne Corps, which was our Corps headquarters over the 30th Division. I'm sending this to Dr. McKay, and he can reproduce it. Let any of those who care for such things have it and use it for whatever reason they need it for. I can tell you one personal item that I've never told. My experiences have been in about 6 books. I've never told it, but I will tell you this. I got very little food when I was captured, 1 decent meal in 90 hours, and a few odds and ends. I swore a great oath that I would eat Christmas dinner with my division commander. I escaped from the Germans at 4 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1944, before daylight. I fought tooth and nail to get through the interrogations and headquarters I had to go through, the 82nd Airborne CP, the 18th Airborne Corps back at Werbemont. Then I was finally got in a Jeep with a driver, and he took me around to Spa, where the 30th Division CP was. By then it was 1 o'clock, 1300, and I was afraid I'd missed the start of the Christmas dinner and was going to interrupt General Hobbs sitting down at his feast. Well, it so happened that the people were just sitting down, just getting ready to sit down. I would say I got there 5 minutes before they sat down. Well, the first request I made after the pounding me on the back and initial questioning, I asked Dick Stevens, our Chief of Staff, to get to the rear CP by phone and cut off the wire telling my wife I was missing in action, see if he could stop that wire. He did so and told me that he had stopped the wire. Well, it so happened he didn't stop the wire. The wire did go. But the good news is, at the table was a very well-known reporter named Hal Boyle, had my same first name. He picked up my story during the meal, and that night broke the radio story in stateside radio, and my wife heard that through many sources that night. So when the missing in action wire came through, she wasn't worried. She knew I'd escaped, and eased my mind greatly. Suffice it to say, the 30th Division accomplished its mission beautifully, with many distinguished incidents by various people throughout the Bulge. And Colonel Peiper, who commanded the spearhead we ran into and who captured me and interrogated me, went no further after he met our troops. We returned 100 miles back to the north, crossed the Roar. On 25 February, we moved out from the woods across the Roar to an objective called Helen. The town's name was Holland, the objective's name was Helen. All the battalion had then was 2 TDs, these open type 3-inch Navy gun, TD, about the size of a medium tank. For tanks, we had 1 light tank company. I gave 1 platoon to 1 lead company, company minus to the other company. My OP was right on the edge of these thick woods west of Ulick. And the 2 TDs were sitting about 80 yards to my left, overwatching this broad, gently rolling plain. And in the distance, you could see the town of Holland, objective Helen. As I watched after they crossed the line of departure, all of a sudden, I could see a big tank boom, shooting exactly 90 degrees across my front. I immediately looked to the left to see what the TD was reacting, and one of my light tanks flamed up. It was a direct hit on the part of this German tank. And I waited, and he didn't shoot my TD. Well, I immediately took off at a dead run 80 yards to my left, and just before I got to it, the German tank fired again, and another one of my light tanks went up in smoke. Well, I came up to the TD and said, "There he is! Shoot him!" And a young corporal raised up out of the TD and said, "If I fire, I'll give away my position, Colonel." Well, he fired in the next few seconds, and he flamed the tank the first shot. Later, I used to say that's the funniest thing that happened in the war to me, that statement. Looking back, it is humorous, but at the time, I wasn't amused. We took Helen, knocked out a couple more tanks. The enemy in this area was 11th Panzer and 9th Panzer, remnants of them. They'd been pretty badly boogered up, but their tankers fought good fights. 2 days later, 25 February, Königshofen. Königshofen was a much larger town than Helen. It was an angle attack across, again, like Helen, open ground. Well, the new thing added, off to the right was a high mesa on which there was about a company or at least 2 platoons of probably Mark V tanks. That was a Mark V, the one the TD got. Most of the tanks we were hitting in here were Mark Vs. Darn good tanks with long 75s on them. These tanks were sitting up on this mesa and pecked at my troops as they moved across this wide open ground. I was with one of the lead companies. It's quite a distance, further to go than Helen was. Our casualties were relatively modest. But I learned in this attack a great deal about German farming, particularly their use of sugar beets. Sugar beets are pretty large objects. The Germans used them to feed stock, and the way they kept them throughout the winter was pile them in windrows and dig around the long hilled up row with shovels and throw dirt over them till they put a pretty thick layer of dirt over them to protect them from the cold weather. And as they use them, they dig into the dirt use the beets, and those that are rotten, they just throw into this ditch to help level the ground again. Well, as we moved across this open area to dodge the tank fire and the artillery, which just pecked at us under this long approach march, we would guide on a windrow of those beets. And if the incoming got close, we would dive and land in this trench, about half full of rotten sugar beets. You can imagine how the average GI looked when he got to Königshofen. I was well covered, and so was most of them. We learned two interesting things after getting into Königshofen. A field marshal had just finished visiting this town. We figured it could have been Rundstedt, who commanded the rest. It could have been Model, who Hitler had some feeling that Rundstedt sympathized with the people who tried to kill him with the assassination attempt. Plus, he felt Rundstedt was a little defeatist, always asking for more troops and complaining why he wasn't winning. And Model had been put in there in addition to Rundstedt to give him additional oomph. At any rate, a field marshal had just visited this town. We didn't capture him. And the second item was the largest explosion I heard in the war. We don't know what it was. It happened after the battalion had closed into the town. I suspect it was a giant mine set under a building. I think the predominant people hurt was elements of the 823rd Tank Battalion. I can't remember much damage at all to my troops, but it was a gigantic explosion. It could have been that large mortar that we never ran into. I think we captured one. About 700 or 600 or 720 millimeter mortar mounted on a gigantic chassis. It must have been a King Tiger tank chassis. 2.5-ton truck showed up a few days later, and we were taken back to the Meuse River to initiate training for the Rhine crossing. My throat is a little dry. Let's take a 10 or 15-minute break and go get a drink of water or whatever you want. Let's break. The Rhine crossing was the most nearly perfect operation that the 2nd Battalion had in my experience in the war. There were several reasons for this. In the first place, we went back and had excellent rehearsals. By far the most rehearsals and preparation of any operation in the war. First place, we were doing it under Field Marshal Montgomery, 21 Army Group. We were on the right flank of his 1st Commando Brigade, which took Wesel. 2nd Battalion was selected to be the assault battalion for the 30th Division. Secondly, every man in the combat units scrutinized his exact movement on a detailed sand table in my battalion headquarters. A beautiful job on the sand table. Third, platoon leaders and up flew over the area, not exactly over the area, they owned this side of the Rhine, and looked in on the ground all the way to their individual objectives. And finally, and probably most importantly, we had 56 artillery battalions firing for our battalion. By far the most artillery we ever had. The operation worked out perfectly. We captured 301 enemy prisoners, most of them stupefied and stunned by the massive artillery. In the headquarters building that I selected, looking through our BC scope, we captured 21 Germans down in the basement. Food on the stove still cooking. Our own casualties, 8 WIA, no KIA. This was all the occupants of one storm boat that one member stepped on a bouncing Betty. and it's my understanding that none of these WIA were seriously wounded. A bridge was put in right on that spot, and for those of you who are interested in such things, that's where Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery, and Churchill came up, and the head of the British government urinated in the Rhine River, as he'd been threatening to do all along. Shortly after that, 2.5-ton trucks rolled up again. We joined up with the Second Armored, and we started rolling across the wide open North German plain. A higher headquarters intelligence officer said no organized resistance was left in northern Germany. Well, you know, those are great lines, and they may be accurate from a large-scale viewpoint, but we had 3 of the toughest short battles of the war after this point. So it's difficult to tell a GI down in a rifle platoon that there's no organized resistance left when he's having to fight like hell for his life. We came on the Teutoburger Wall, which was a long, roughly north-south hill stretching across the North German plain, a beautiful defensive line. We expected it to be defended, and it was. We came to a screeching halt. I immediately took over the battle. When you're with an armored division and you're rolling on the road, the tank battalion commander commands the spearhead. When you hit resistance, he can't move. The infantry battalion commander commands. Well, I took over at the Teutoburger Wall, and we had a fierce couple of days battle. We had to commit to reserve. G Company came up and highly successfully crushed the situation through. I was concerned about my battalion not getting a presidential unit citation. We had already submitted a division one, which I wasn't sure would fly. We'd already submitted a regimental one, the one in the Bulge, which I wasn't sure would fly. Those higher unit ones are tough to get. I said, as soon as we have a real good operation, I'm going to write up a presidential unit citation. Well, we didn't have enough actual fighting at the Rhine. We had too few casualties. But at the Teutoburger Wall, we had casualties. A lot of them shot in the head by snipers. It's a tough, fierce, even though short fight, and all units participated and took casualties. I had written up, best we could, a presidential unit citation, and it sailed right through. So if any of you out there know anyone that do not know that we won the presidential unit citation, it doesn't show in our division history or our regimental history. We did get one for this battle at the Teutoburger Wall. Along about this time, a dark-haired young second lieutenant reported into me, and I had a rule that every officer would come by me before he joined the battalion. And he came by my office, which probably was a kitchen table in a German farmhouse, and I had a little slip of paper that my adjutant always furnished on his name, what about him he could figure out, and the adjutant's recommendation on where he should go. Well, I looked at him and I said, "Welcome to the 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Baudouin." And he smiled, his jaw dropped. He said, "Colonel, where are you from? You're the first guy in the military that ever pronounced my name correctly." I said, "I went to school at LSU and love Cajun food." We had a good talk. Turned out he was from Homer, Louisiana, H-O-U-M-A, and a real Cajun. Fine boy. A few days later, he won the Medal of Honor posthumously, cleaning out 2 machine gun nests of Germans that was cutting his platoon to ribbons. Just outside the city of Hamelin, Germany, where the Pied Piper, not far from where the Pied Piper was supposed to pipe the rats down to their death and led the children out of the town. We sailed on with the 2nd Armored and came up to the Elbe River, where we split off from CCB, Colonel Polk, and joined CCR, Colonel Russ Jenna of the 2nd Armored, and moved into a bridgehead across the Elbe River. near Barbie that the 83rd Division had put in. I was given a new operations order, and the last goose egg on it was right in the Tiergarten area of Berlin. We were considerably under 100 kilometers, about 42 miles from Berlin at that point. And most of the Germans we were hitting in those days were just waving us on and fighting the Russians with the other hand. We took a few towns heading straight toward Germany, heading straight toward Berlin, and all of a sudden we got an order to stop. Eisenhower told all units to stop forward movement. We never moved forward another inch. E Company was sitting in a town called Gütergluck, along with its tank company, and E Company was given a break, told to take a rest, pull off the line. A company of armored engineers, 17th Armored, was given the job of outposting the town with the tanks after Eisenhower stopped us. And E Company was back doing what most GIs do when they get a break, get some sack time in cellars, in town, in houses, in this town of Gütergluck. When all of a sudden, the last battle against the 2nd Battalion, against the 119th Regiment, took place. Rather than the regular German infantrymen, 300 cadets from a military academy was told they'd get some schnapps, they'd get some tank-like, some SP guns, and make one last glorious fling against the Americans. So these 300 young cadets, and I presume they had some SS senior officers leading them, were assigned 12 SP PAC-40s. This was about a long 75 gun on a Mark IV chassis, open top, like our TDs, but excellent weapons to accompany infantry, and they killed just as good as a tank. They slammed into Gütergluck. They broke the engineer company. Elements of them started streaming back south of town. The attack came from generally the northeast. E Company waked up from their cellars and began fighting an enemy that was all among them in the streets as a result of this engineer company breaking and letting them get into town. The situation was somewhat desperate. I moved with Russ Jenna, the commander of the total task force, to a small copse of pine trees just outside of town. We couldn't get into town. Fighting was hot and heavy all over. Very quickly, I told Fox Company, and I've forgotten whether it's Eddie Arn or Hingline commanding at that time, I told him to head south, be very careful not to knock out any friendlies, but work in carefully and prevent any reinforcement of this initial group that smashed this engineer company and was giving E Company fits. Sergeant Van East, Lieutenant Holycross, and PFC Mallory were in the company headquarters house and did a yeoman job of knocking out one or two of these SPs, killing some infantry, and stopping further movement adjacent to their house. Both Holycross and Van East were wounded. PFC Earl Hensel did a yeoman job of leading a counterattack that helped put the quietus on the aggressiveness of these young cadets. Other splendid actions took place, and E Company proved a superlative combat outfit by handling the attack. Fox Company from the north effectively sealed off any further movement, and together about 125 PWs were taken, 89 KIA, so you might say the bulk of the enemy were either captured or killed, and 7 of the Pac-40s were knocked out. The others took off. This was the last battle of the war for the 2nd Battalion. On 2 May, G Company met the Russians. They brought in a little lieutenant colonel out of Zhukov's infantry division, out of his Zhukov's 8th Route Army, took him to my headquarters, and we toasted Truman and Stalin in champagne. Then I went across the river with him, and we toasted Stalin and Truman in vodka, and we welcomed the Russians. Shortly after that, we were assigned, the battalion, 250 square mile area of occupation right on the Elbe. Our headquarters town was Schönebeck, a fairly nice town of 75,000. Had a nice Junkers plant in it, built airplanes. We had 2 more locations, one very short of occupation, and then Hirschberg, where we stayed a month. The leather capital of Germany. It's a fairly small town, but a tremendous leather factory. And I believe half the battalion had boots made there. I lived in the Leather King's castle. He had built a tower, new part of the castle, and had a 3-man bronze elevator that went up the side of the tower. And in it was absolutely gorgeous furniture, silk sheets, and in the bathroom was a miracle. I couldn't believe it. I don't know how many of probably most of my headquarters came up that 3-man elevator and looked at this miracle. I know most of my battalion commanders and a lot of my battalion officers outside the headquarters came up and looked at this miracle. It was a toilet that had no gurgle. You talk about German engineers being smart. When you eliminate the gurgle out of a toilet, you've done something. Now, we were there a month, and toward the last week of that month, a small gurgle began to set in. Well, I didn't know where to go to get the engineer to eliminate the gurgle. Maybe he'd been killed a long time ago. But, ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you that initially that toilet had no gurgle. During this period here, we showed everybody in the battalion a film on to Tokyo. The regimental commander told me that we were going to be the floating reserve in Operation Olympic, which was taking the main island, Honshu, in Japan. And we expected probably 1 million casualties among the Allies. Colonel Baker also told me that he was going to give me a slight better chance to live by making me regimental exec and give the next replacement lieutenant colonel the 2nd Battalion. Shortly afterward, a fine bushy-tailed lieutenant colonel, class of 38 out of the point, came in named Schmidt, and he became 2nd Battalion commander, and I moved up. Any Army commander worth his salt will let his men know either directly or inferentially that they are the best, that they are good. Well, the 30th commanders had it easier over other commanders in that they didn't have to lie about it. I have a letter in my hand that I would like to read you. Now, probably most of you know of this letter. Some of you may not. I'm going to give this copy right here to Doc McKay, if he'll return it to me. It's my only copy, to reproduce and pass out to any of you who might want this. It's a pretty precious letter, I think. It's from S.L.A. Marshall, who was historian of the ETO. He worked for General Eisenhower. Dear General Hobbs, that's our division commander. Now that I'm leaving the service, I thought it might be well to give you the following information for whatever satisfaction you may derive therefrom. I was historian of the ETO. Toward the end of last fall, for the purpose of breaking the logjam of paper concerning division presidential unit citations, General Eisenhower instructed me to draw up a rating sheet on the divisions. This entailed in the actual proceeding that we had to go over the total work of all the more experienced divisions, infantry and armor, and report back to him which divisions we considered had performed the most efficiently and consistent battle service. We did so, and we named certain infantry divisions in the first category, the same with armor, and we placed others in a second category, and yet others in a third. The 30th was among 5 divisions in the first category. However, we placed the 30th Division number 1 on the list of first category divisions. It was a combined judgment of the approximately 35 historical officers who'd worked on the records and in the field that the 30th had merited this distinction. It was our finding that the 30th had been outstanding in 3 operations and that we could consistently recommend it for citation on any one of these operations. It was further found that it had in no single instance performed discreditably or weakly when considered among the averages of the theater, and that in no operation had it carried less than its share of the burden or looked bad when compared with the forces on its flanks. We were especially impressed with the fact that it had consistently achieved results without undue wastage of its men. I don't know whether any further honors will come to the 30th. I hope they do. For we had to keep looking at the balance of things always, and we felt that the 30th was the outstanding infantry division of the ETO. Respectfully yours, S.L.A. Marshall, Colonel. I have another letter here that I got from Marshall. After the war, I was assigned as tactics instructor of infantry at Fort Knox. And you know, Abrams commanded the tactics department at Knox, and he was my boss there. All I heard about was the 4th Armored, where Abrams served. And I thought that the 2nd Armored was a pretty good outfit, and I suspected Marshall might have rated the 2nd Armored over the 4th Armored. So I looked around and found out where Marshall was after the war. He was a reporter working for Detroit News. I wrote him a letter and asked him for additional information with specific information on armored divisions. I'm not going to read this, but he did send me back a letter in which he said the 2nd rated over the 4th. I didn't push that around heavily at Knox, but I told a few of my key friends. There's one item I will mention. The 3 top divisions he remembered was the 30th, 5th, and 1st, in that order. I will also send this letter to be reproduced by Doc McKay for any of those of you who want it. There's another item that I thought you might be interested in. I came upon, or rather was sent, a casualty list. How many replacements went through all the units of the ETO. And I took my stubby pencil and I figured out percentages on my battalion. And I came up with these percentages for those of you who are interested in such things. Now bear in mind, this doesn't mean battle casualties only. It means replacements to keep these units at full strength. Battle casualties and non-battle casualties were almost even. People coming down with sickness, mental problems, desertion, KIA, WIA. Rifle companies, 600% for the war. All 3 of my companies were very close to 6%, 600%. Heavy weapons company, 300%. Total casualties for the entire war. Headquarters company, 100%. After Hirschberg, we moved into Oklahoma City briefly, which was a camp in France, stayed there a very short time, and then moved to our last camp where we would ready ourselves to get on a boat, Lucky Strike. lime pit latrines, pyramidal tent, pot-bellied stoves, a thoroughly disagreeable camp. After Hirschberg, the leather capital of Germany, this was a pretty sorry billet. Well, Colonel Baker and I, like good infantry commanders, reconnoitered the area. First, we went up to Fécamp, France, where the Benedictine monks ran their famous distillery and made that marvelous stuff called Benedictine and Dame. I've forgotten whether they gave us a sample, but at any rate, our second port of call was up the River Seine from Le Havre to the first bridge, across the river, then down the coast, through the first town to the second town called Deauville, which we'd heard was the finest watering place to have fun on the entire Atlantic coast. Well, we found a beautiful small town, beautiful beach, tremendous casino, gambling place, and quite a nice boardwalk with lots of shops, most of them closed, and several beautiful hotels. We also found a major, hard-working, serious, and some enlisted men who were caretakers of these hotels, which was a way station for Corps and Higher headquarters, POM units heading back to the States. As soon as we became aware of what we had there, I looked at Colonel Baker and he looked at me, and both of us had a persimmon-eating grin like two possums as we realized the possibilities of the situation. We told him, we found out first when was his next unit coming in, and it was 3 weeks away. We told him our problem of this dull, dusty camp, bored men undergoing processing and needing a change of pace. Well, he allowed immediately that that was beyond his authority and that he felt real bad, but he couldn't do anything about it. I motioned Colonel Baker to one side and said, "Colonel, I need to get 101 with this guy, and I think I can budge him." And Colonel's sharp man, very sharp, darn good commander, he agreed with me, and he eased off, got on the boardwalk, and sight saw a little while I continued the work. I looked this major in the eye and said, "Major, you've got a great opportunity here. You've been back here in ComZone and missed the war." I said, "You've been given a second chance. Although the armistice has been signed, just above here at Camp Lucky Strike is the finest regiment in Eisenhower's theater, officially declared. The 30th Division's been called the SS troops of Roosevelt, Roosevelt's SS. I said, you can let these #1 fighters come down and enjoy something that's under your command. I said, you have facilities here that are not going to be used for 3 weeks, and you are in command of these facilities. I said, the essence of winning, of making good in war and in making good in life, is to have initiative and to take advantage of your opportunities. I said, Colonel Baker and I are trying to take advantage of an opportunity. You have the ability to reward our initiative, and you can show this initiative yourself by letting these troops enjoy a little of the flesh pots that these way higher headquarters that didn't suffer any casualties are enjoying when they come through. Well, he began to soften a little, and finally, with the aid of a case of 12 bottles of 3-star Hennessy, 15 years old, which he probably couldn't get hold of easily. He didn't capture as much as a frontline regiment did, capturing towns. He agreed, after we worked out the details on charges for Lenin, the band, opening the casino, etc., and any other charges, food, rations, etc. We ran nearly the whole regiment through that lovely town. 2 nights, 3 days, Deauville. In conclusion, let me say that it's approximately 42 years since I relinquished command of this great battalion in that dusty French camp. My memories have dimmed in many areas of those hectic times, but my memories haven't dimmed at the keen pride I felt in this command. It was a great privilege to have soldiered with you. My thoughts are with you as you hoist a toast to those who've gone before. Farewell, and God bless you.